U.S. President Donald Trump has asked the Federal Communications Commission to deny China Mobile's entry into the U.S. market, citing national security fears. Why? Is he being paranoid, or does he really have a point? And as foreign ministers converge on Vienna to discuss what to do in the aftermath of America pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, what will happen if they cannot find a workaround to the problem? Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. Again, U.S.'s national security threatened. At the request of U.S. President Donald Trump, the Commerce Department has recommended that the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC, deny China Mobile's entry into the U.S. market, citing national security fears. David Reddell, Assistant Secretary for Communications and Information at the Commerce Department, said that after significant engagement with China Mobile, concerns about increased risks to U.S. law enforcement and national security interests were unable to be resolved. The move by the Commerce Department came just days before the Trump administration is expected to enact multi-billion-dollar tariffs on Chinese goods on Friday. Is the Trump administration's concern justified? Is there a connection between the decision and the escalating trade tensions between the two sides? Joining me for the discussion in the Beijing studio is Charles Liu, a political commentator and founder of Hao Capital, a China-focused private equity firm, and in Columbus, Ohio, Professor Oded Shenkar at Ohio State University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Shenkar, let me go to you first. Now, in its filing to the FCC, the NTIA, or the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, under the Commerce Department, said because China Mobile is subject to exploitation, influence and control by the Chinese government, the executive branch believes that granting China Mobile's application would produce substantial and unacceptable national security and law enforcement risks. Professor Shenkar, do you think such a claim is solid? What exactly is threatening the U.S. national security? Do you see that?
Yes. So to begin with, to be fair, I don't think that the U.S. carrier would be allowed, into China, the way China Mobile sought to enter the U.S. So there is also an issue of reciprocity here. But both governments have become acutely aware, I think, of the risks of control of communication and information, and both governments actually embedded in national security concern. Now, is it part of a broader trade and investment dispute? Absolutely yes.
Well, Charles, I wonder how you would counter what Professor Shenkar just mentioned. First of all, by the way, we all use, a lot of people in China use iPhone, right? If we talk about national security concerns, the Chinese government could well have blocked iPhone to operate in China to be sold in China for a long time, but China didn't do that. Charles, what is your take?
Well, I think absolutely. If you talk about national security issues, you have basically three parts to telecommunications. One is the equipment, two is the phones themselves, and the third is an operator. So it's three different types of business. And we're now, if you talk about Apple, there's no question that Apple is being used at nearly 25% of the Chinese market. The Chinese government can claim that there are national security issues there. But I don't take the national security argument from the U.S. very seriously, because for national security reasons, Canada is slapped with a tariff on steel and aluminum. Canada, national security risk. So it's the application from China Mobile has been there for a long time. So every administration did not want to tear it down and confront the Chinese government on this. But Mr. Trump seems to be taking a different position.
Well, that could explain the timing of this decision at this particular moment. Let's also listen to what the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs has said in response to a related question. Let's listen to this.
We urge the relevant U.S. party to discard the outdated Cold War and zero-sum mentality to put the issue in perspective and stop groundless speculations and unreasonable suppression of Chinese companies.
Well, basically, in the recommendation by... Yes,
May
go
I
ahead.
add something to
Sure.
this? Huawei and ZTE equipment was blocked from the U.S. market for national security reasons. Now, Huawei's equipment is all over Europe. In fact, most of European countries, 3G and 4G infrastructure was built with Huawei and ZTE equipment, and there didn't seem to be a national security issue there.
Well, indeed. I mean, if you think that... yeah, Professor Shenkar, you would like to respond. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to respond to that. I mean, first of all, to the early comment, vis-a-vis Apple. I mean, part of the deal where Apple was allowed, to operate in China is basically opening its code to the Chinese authorities. There are many other examples, such as Google, that, did not agree and therefore were barred from the Chinese market. As far as the comparison to the European Union, that is correct. That the European Union, maybe because it is a multi-country entity, has been fairly late to look at incoming foreign investment in terms of national security. Again, this is really a kind of a conglomerate of national units. But if you look at individual countries, they have started to push for that. Germany is definitely a case, and the European Union actually is in the process of establishing a CFIUS-like type of an agency. So one could argue that the Europeans have simply been a little bit late, into that game. As far as the comparison to Canada and steel, Mr. Liu, obviously have a point, but it is true that at least as far as current legislation goes, the main logic for stopping foreign investment coming into the United States is that of national security. So yes, you could argue that this excuse, so to speak, has been overused, but one could say the same about China, which also has a fairly broad definition of what national security really is.
I do not know. I don't think Chinese government has used this excuse to block foreign investment as much as the United States have been doing. Anyway, I want to ask both of you, what does it mean for U.S. consumers, however, now that China Mobile or Huawei or ZTE have been banned from getting access to the market? What kind of loss is there for the consumers, Charles?
I think the biggest issue is not what is happening now, it's what will happen starting next year with 5G. Most of the patents on a global basis, the majority of the patents are actually in the hands of Huawei and ZTE. If China, as projected, will roll out 5G before any other country on a nationwide basis, then the economies of scale for the equipment, for the handsets, and so on and so forth, may become much more valuable in other countries as well. So the U.S. will probably be a market that will be slower and later in coming with the rollout of 5G as a result.
But as have shown by this recommendation, it seems that the United States is willing to enjoy a slower service or more to pay for, or ask its consumers to pay for more expensive products at the expense of letting Chinese investment coming into the country. Professor Shenkar, how do you look at the balance between these two concerns?
You are absolutely right. Almost any time you block foreign investment or import into a country, a consumer will pay a price. They will pay a price in higher cost. They will pay a price sometimes in slower introduction of technology. That is all true. Mm-hmm. It's a governmental decision as to whether they are overriding national concern that should trump those consideration. And there is definitely a debate also within the United States as to whether a consumer should be paying such a price. I am not sure that we hear much of a debate about telecommunication. I mean, my feeling is that there is more of an understanding that this is something that is more sensitive, but generally speaking, yes, you definitely have to look at the trade-off between these two considerations.
Right.
The public good, the consumer good, if you will, and the national good as defined by the government.
I would add something going back to the European situation. CFIUS-like type of discussion in Europe taking place is not reaching the telecommunication side in terms of mobile phone set. On the internet, privacy, and Germany is very, very keen on privacy. What we have is a situation with the mobile side in Europe. I remember 6 or 7 years ago when I was in Sweden, the rollout of 4G in Sweden was all given to Huawei purely for business reasons. Not because it's much cheaper, but it's just the Huawei engineers were able to roll it out at half the time of Ericsson or Nokia. So it was purely for solid business reasons, and there has not been any complaint from the European countries, government included, on whether or not the Chinese operators, the
Charles,
Chinese...
I think what the Americans are thinking is, although there might not be any complaints right now, but in the future it is possible that Chinese government would say, Huawei or China Mobile, you go and spy on the US, and they will have to do that. I think that is the concern that's reflected in this recommendation. And what I wanted also to say is that it seems that it's not just telecommunications sector is being protected under the so-called national security clause, but really a lot of investments are being put under extensive period of time of review under the CFIUS. Charles, your business personally have been blocked. What is the sentiment among the business circle about this atmosphere that is plaguing, that is killing business? Charles.
Okay, it's been absolutely hopeless for us to complete some of the transactions that we're doing in terms of investment in the US because of lack of clarity, lack of predictability. We're all working in a global supply chain and a global value chain. When you don't know whether or not one piece is going to be taken out by a CFIUS review, then you can't go ahead with the whole project. And you know, on one project we've spent $600,000–700,000 on legal fees already, still no answer as to whether or not we'd be subject to CFIUS. And this is the same for American companies, not just Chinese companies or European companies, American companies as well. It's getting very complicated.
Well, definitely things don't look like they're turning for the better in the near future. We have to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests, Charles Liu, founder of Hao Capital, and in Columbus, Ohio, Professor Oded Shenkar at Ohio State University. You have been watching The Point with me, Li Xin. We'll take a short break, but when we come back, I'll be asking what might happen if the remaining signatories to the Iran nuclear deal fail to come up with a workable compromise to satisfy Iran. Stay with us. Foreign ministers from Iran and 5 world powers will be meeting in the Austrian capital Vienna on Friday to try to save the nuclear deal, also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, without the United States. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Jawad Zarif and his counterparts from France, Germany, China, Russia and Britain will discuss an economic package that the European countries have promised to supply Iran in the coming days. Iranian leaders have said they will uphold their side of the deal, which involves strict curbs on their nuclear program, if the other signatories uphold theirs by making sure that Iran can keep doing business with the world despite revived U.S. sanctions. But Iran has also warned it is ready to resume uranium enrichment to 20% within days if the agreement falls apart. This would be above the level permitted in the agreement. American diplomats will not participate in the talks since the United States is no longer a party to the deal. But senior Trump administration officials will talk with European diplomats on the sidelines of the meeting about efforts to further restrain Iran. So how likely are the two remaining signatories of the deal to be able to come up with a workable solution with Iran, and what would be the consequences if they cannot? I'm joined from Tehran by Seyed Mostafa Khoshcheshm, a political analyst, and from New York, Max Wolff, chief economist of the iCash group. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, before leaving Tehran for his European tour, Rouhani said that he expects European nations to unveil a package of measures aimed at preserving the accord, though Iran has already warned it is ready to resume uranium enrichment, as I said. And Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei laid out a series of conditions in May that he said must be met for Iran to stay in the deal. So, to my guest in Iran, what specific measures is Rouhani looking for this time, or is the Iranian delegation looking for, rather?
Hello, and thanks for having me on the show. Well, as a matter of fact, there are 7 conditions that Iran has requested. One is punishing the United States by the Europeans, actually. The United States has withdrawn from the deal with no good reason, and when Iran has complied with all its undertakings. So other signatories to this deal, including the Europeans, Russia and China, they should do something about it, about the United States rebellion, actually, or bullying approach towards the deal, demanding more and more, and it has defied its undertakings. But the most important part of these conditions or prerequisites are ensuring the same thing that Iran has been promised under the deal. That is, ensuring that Tehran could supply as many barrels of crude as it wants, and also wiring the money and transferring it back to Tehran. These two need to be, guaranteed. Iran's merits under the JCPOA, 80% of Iran's merits pertain to the removal of the U.S. sanctions. With the U.S. withdrawal, we could say 80% of Iran's merits are gone, while the Western countries are demanding Iran to show self-restraint, and Iran has been doing so, and they've been demanding Tehran to comply with all its undertakings as before. They, maximum, could just provide Iran with 20% of the promises that they made under the JCPOA. Right. Now, this time, taking its lesson from the past, Iran says, okay, if the 20% of merits is going to be given to me on the paper, I want insurances this time in order to make sure that these merits would not be worn off.
Okay, Mr. Wolff, how likely do you think Iran's preconditions or Iran's conditions can be met this time, given two things? For instance, the kind of difficulty that the European governments will have in forcing what their companies do in Iran.
Yes, so I think over most of the last 40 years of U.S. isolation policy with Iran, it would have been very hard to imagine European or other allies ever sort of taking the risk of their quote-unquote good relations with the U.S. and access to the world's largest economy. It's still quite a challenge, but I think the alienating of global allies and the sort of picking of global fights, so many of them at the same time, with so many of our allies, so many folks who are signatories to JCPOA, means that for the first time in a long time, it is actually quite possible that this agreement lives on after the U.S. A little bit the pattern we're seeing here with agreements, whether it's the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the Paris Climate Accords, that the U.S. sort of relatively rapid and unilateral decision to pull out of the community of nations is creating prospects that would have been hard to imagine 6 or 12 months ago.
Yeah, but practically, how is it possible for European governments to tell their companies to stay in Iran if the U.S. is going to reinstate its sanctions, blocking any companies from accessing U.S. financial and economic structures, if they deal with Iran? Mr. Wolff.
Right, so it looks like the only way to sort of keep it going under all that is if the United States does two things, both of which have been discussed a bit: push back deadlines. So we started with these relatively aggressive, unrealistic November deadlines for everyone to have a zero interaction on a go-forward basis with Iran by November, which is incredibly aggressive and probably not really fully practical timeline. So we could push that back. Or, and that's the other sort of the special dispensation. So there has been a lot of talk about giving allowances or allowing various parties who are already engaged in Iran to remain engaged, and the U.S. would either officially or unofficially agree not to sanction those activities.
Mr. Khoshcheshm, in Tehran, what kind of political pressure is the Iranian leader facing domestically at this moment? We know over the weekend there are some protests on the street, and some analysts are pointing out that Mr. Rouhani is facing the worst moment in his political career. Is that the case?
Well, as a matter of fact, you know, ever since Rouhani rose to power, he was given a mandate by a majority of voters to go for talks with the world powers in order to try this problem settlement approach. And Iran was actually in pursuit of resolving the differences, and it did its best. While the United States strategy has always been based on containment and not problem settlement and solution of the differences between the two sides. After the U.S. defied the deal and defied its undertakings under the deal, President Rouhani waited for some time in order to see if the Europeans could force the U.S. When they didn't do any move, now it seems that at least in the last few months, even those who, you know, they were advocates of talks with the West, now they have lost their faith in problem solution through talks and diplomacy with the West. And the camp of those who were critics of the deal and talks with the United States and with the West, they have grown much more powerful, not just among the public, but also among politicians, among those that are in the government who believed in the approach that President Rouhani went for. So the talks and the statements made by President Rouhani in Europe just in the last 2 or 3 days shows that he is going to go tough also. He is going to move closer to the principalist camp, and he is distancing himself from those who believe in talks with the U.S.-led West. So basically, I believe President Rouhani is pushed by the U.S. and by the Europeans' prolonged decision-making with regard to these insurances to go tough and to go actually to get closer to the principalist camp.
So how will the outcome of this weekend's meeting in Vienna impact Rouhani's leverage at home, and how realistic can you expect that the European signatories of the deal can actually come up with some kind of a compensation package for Iran?
Well, you know, Europeans, either they are not able to force their companies, major and large companies, or they are not willing to do so. They cannot anyway force their companies to work with Iran, but they, at the same time, they intend to keep the deal because they are after the containment strategy. They want to contain Iran's nuclear industry and its missile industry, as well as its regional influence. These are the main power components of Iran, and they are trying to, you know, harness Iran's power in all these areas step by step. That was the approach that was initiated by the United States under Obama, President Obama. And there is some good reason to believe that the United States is still after the same approach, but it's playing the good cop, bad cop you know, scenario against Tehran in order to force Tehran to agree to the terms of the Europeans when faced with the harsh you know, approach of the Donald Trump administration. In this context, Iran has issued warnings that it would not go for any other talks over its missile industry or regional power, and it would demand its merits under the deal. It would not go for prolonging this deal
Right.
after the 10 years, even if the Europeans comply with their undertakings.
So, Mr. Wolff, do you see the two sides coming to some kind of a stalemate? I mean, Iran refusing to get soft, whereas the United States is always very, very hawkish and talking about using maximum economic and diplomatic pressure to bring Iran to the negotiating table. What's your take?
Yeah, so it's very hard to be optimistic here. The Iranian public, as we heard from someone much better positioned to understand it than myself, was told this was a good agreement to lift a long period of really economic depression, right, of depressing the level of economic activity through sanctions. There was much enthusiasm. It was really barely 3 years ago, start to see sort of the first green shoots of opening up, and then to have those be crushed under the boot of someone's domestic political agenda, I'm sure was a tough message. I think the Europeans have made pretty clear that they're interested in keeping the deal alive, but quite frustrated. I would expect they'll get no support from the U.S. And the truth is that as the months have gone by, U.S. relations with China, with India, with Europe, with other countries in North America have deteriorated. So it's very hard to be optimistic, but you want to remain hopeful. The world is better off with this deal than without it.
Yeah, one last quick question to Mr. Wolff, please. We're looking at Pompeo going to Pyongyang, shaking hands and talking to Kim Jong-un, and a country which claims to already have nuclear weapons. And then, you see United States getting very tough on Iran, which has promised to stop its development towards a nuclear weapon. Do you see any irony in there?
It's much worse than an irony. The United States keeps, whether on purpose or by accident, sending the world the message that it's pretty dangerous to not have nuclear weapons if you have trouble getting along with the United States. Part of the reason for this agreement, part of the hope around the agreement, was to prevent an arms race in the Middle East. And I think, sadly, that's more likely without this deal, and this deal looks fairly unlikely to survive in its present form.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to my two guests from Tehran, Seyed Mostafa Khoshcheshm, a political analyst, and from New York, Max Wolff, chief economist of the iCash Group. And that is it for this edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.